Cedric. So I would like to welcome all of you. Thank you very much for making time for our first STIAS public lecture for the second semester, but the fourth since the year began. The year began very well that we have participants in presence. We were doing hybrid before, and it's nice to see that increasingly the number of individuals coming to attend a public lecture. But I would like also to welcome the colleagues who are attending online, and I can see that we have a very healthy presence online. So thank you for joining these conversations at STIAS. And as we usually say, they are beginnings of conversations rather than end of these conversations. And so thank you for this engagement. For the ones online, my name is Edward Chilumira, the Director for Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Study. We will also be saying goodbye for now to Jody and Amy, who will be departing this weekend, unless they change their mind. But Dave has already changed his mind, so he's staying for another week. So we appreciate that, and we continue to engage with Jody and Amy, and we wish you bon voyage. As the practice is for the public lectures, as different from the internal fellows seminars, the introductions are done by colleagues with whom we are relating with, and we usually ask our colleagues from Stellenbosch University, depending on the department that is in line with the presentation, to come and present the speaker for the public lecture. And for this public lecture, the presenter will be introduced by Dr. Guy Lamb, who is over there. And Guy is the BA International Studies Program Leader within the Political Science Department at the University of Stellenbosch University. And I'm sure that we do have other colleagues from Stellenbosch University. And so partly they are here to see how Guy does his job in introducing speakers, but also for being part of this. Guy is also serves as a commissioner with the High-Level National Planning Commission, the Presidency of the Republic of South Africa, where he chairs the Commission's Justice, Crime Prevention, and Security Task Team. Between 2012 and 2020, he was also the director of the Safety and Violence Initiative at the University of Cape Town. And prior to this, he was a senior research fellow at the Institute for Security Studies and senior researcher at the College for Conflict Resolution. So he's a conflict person. But he has worked with numerous governments and various United Nations agencies on peace and security issues. Guy holds a PhD in criminology, and you can tell from the introduction that I've made already, and a master's degree in international and comparative politics from the University of Cape Town. So, Guy, please. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Edward, and thank you so much for the warm introduction to make an introduction. So it's indeed an honor and a privilege to be here to introduce someone I've known for a very long time, Cedric de Koning. I've certainly been familiar with him for the plus 25 years I've been involved in conflict and peace studies and security studies in Africa, familiar with his name. But ready to introduce him, I was wondering what sort of analogy could I use? And the kind of idea of a cricket analogy came to mind, which seems a bit obscure. But those of you familiar with cricket is that they're different parts of the game, they're different specializations. So in cricket, you get specialist batsmen, you get specialist bowlers, sometimes even you get specialist fielders, such as the wicketkeeper. And a rare player to find is an all-rounder, is someone who can bat well, someone who can bowl well, someone who can field well. And that's certainly what came to mind looking at Cedric's CV and knowing Cedric. Because, number one, he's a very accomplished and well-respected scholar and researcher. He's a professor of peace, conflict, and development. He works for the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs that does cutting-edge, state-of-the-art research on peace and conflict. And he leads some very interesting, cutting-edge, progressive projects on resilience, climate change, conflict. So it's very much at this interdisciplinary level. Secondly, he has this rich experience of working within the nonprofit, the think tank kind of sector, and been involved in that in many years. So he's kind of publishing, and if you look at his publication records, you can see, I mean, if he was in South Africa, he would be, one of the top-rated NRF researchers in his field, if he was within South Africa, for example. So publishing has a very high H-index, thousands of citations. So a hugely valuable scholar to peace studies, not only globally, but also in Africa. But he's also spent, many scholars will just spend their time in universities. And you can see Cedric has spent decades working with non-governmental organizations, such as the African Center for the Constructive Resolution of Disputes, ACCORD, which is probably the best known, has the best reputation for peace-building organizations throughout Africa, and has worked with many African governments, has worked in advising different governments and international organizations on peacemaking and peace-building processes. So Cedric's been involved with ACCORD for decades, and he still serves as a special advisor to ACCORD. But also he's worked with various United Nations organizations and entities, worked with the African Union as a sort of senior technical advisor. But then, of course, he's been involved in education and training. So he's working on peacekeeping, peace support operations, and before becoming a scholar, he was in government. He was a diplomat. So he has this kind of range of insights and skills and experience that very few actually have. So with that, kind of can see it in his scholarship. And that's why I'm very excited about listening to today's lecture, because it's about taking all these insights from not only being within the academy, not only kind of working with governments, but being inside governments, but working with civil society and understanding what it's like to make peace and the complexities of making peace. He's going to be talking about this adaptive peace concept. And really just kind of a reference is I actually use this material in my third year class to get the students to grapple with this sort of notion that not everything is imposed. You need to kind of find ways to work and be adaptive in the context of peacemaking. So his work also is focusing on resilience, which is also very exciting and very cutting edge. So we're very lucky to have Cedric here today, and I'm certainly looking forward to his presentation. So thank you so much, Edward. Do I hand back to you? Or to hand to Cedric. Okay, Cedric, over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Guy. That was a very, very kind introduction. Thank you so much, all of you who have come to join us today, and those of you who are online, especially the people here in person, for braving the weather. Lovely to have you and share with you some insights into what I would like to work on whilst I'm here at STIAS. But before I tell you more about my project, I first want to acknowledge this incredible facility and space that we're in, because STIAS and the Wallenberg Foundation and Stellenbosch University has created this incredible cross-disciplinary, research-enabling, knowledge generation-enabling space. And it's such a privilege to be here and to spend a couple of months here and to work on this project that I'm going to spend time working here with you on. Now, there's supposed to be a clicker. Good. Okay. This one, yeah. So I would like to tell you a little bit about the project that I'm going to be working on whilst I'm here at STIAS. As Guy mentioned, over the last 15 years or so, I've been working on applying insights from complexity theory to the field of peace and security studies. And so the book I'm going to be working on is going to consolidate various aspects of the work I've touched upon over the last couple of years and some new insights. And I hope to do this in a way that will somehow weave all of this together in a coherent framework that would make sense. And I'm going to focus especially on 3 areas. I'm going to look at how complexity theory and this adaptive peace concept, how it influences how we understand peace and conflict, how it influences how we can go about trying to influence complex, or let me say, social-ecological systems, complex systems, social systems, but also how we as international peace builders undertake peace building. So also the complexity in our own institutions, whilst we try to engage in influencing complex systems. I can't talk about complexity, though, without first paying tribute to Professor Paul Cellier, who was a professor at the philosophy department here at Stellenbosch University. I had the privilege of doing my PhD under Paul until he passed away in 2011. And I know there's a couple of other people here in the room that have also worked under or collaborated with Paul Cellier. And he had an enormous impact on the study of complexity. I think there's hardly a paper I come across in which he is not cited. So he's an absolute authority in this field. But I didn't realize before I came to STIAS that he also has a very close connection to STIAS. So he's been involved with STIAS almost from the beginning. And he was on the Fellowship and Program Committee since 2008, and he also led a specific STIAS project on complexity. And together with Professor Jan-Henrik Hofmeyr, they created a Center for the Study of Complex Systems, and that center is housed here in the STIAS compound in the old stables of the Muldersdrift farm. So that center is now called the Stellenbosch Center for Sustainability Transitions. So I actually visited that center in 2019, and then one of our colleagues, Rika Preser, who actually also did her PhD under Paul, showed me STIAS and planted the seed that led to me then applying and doing my project here. But talking about the Muldersdrift farm, I'm looking into our kind of ancestors in the complexity field, especially here in South Africa. And so I've been looking a bit again at J.C. Smuts' book on holism and evolution, and the work of Eugene Marais on the soul of the ant and the soul of the ape. And I read in the bibliography or the biography of Eugene Marais that Leon Rousseau did, that his family actually owned the Muldersdrift farm. And he was here as a young boy of about 14 and visited the farmstead. So interesting how, once you start pulling on a thread, everything seems to be connected. So what is the puzzle that I want to work on, that I want to hope to make a contribution to in my project? For me, one of the most important unanswered questions in the history of human politics is how to prevent violent conflict and wars and sustain peace. And I don't mean this in the context of, we're going to achieve world peace in our lifetime, but in terms of what contributions we can make to end specific conflicts and to reduce suffering. And as this graph shows, after declining for much of the 1990s, after that spike that you can see here, which represents the Rwanda genocide and the wars in the Balkans and in Somalia. So after this declining period, after that height, we've seen that the number of civil wars have tripled in the last decade, and various other forms of organized violence is also increasing. 1/4 of humanity, almost 2 billion people, are living in conflict-affected areas today. And the world is facing the highest number of violent conflicts since 1945. There are several reasons for this increase, but one of the things the data is telling us is that the tools we used with some success to manage conflicts in the 1990s is no longer working. So from the perspective of global governance, the second half of the 20th century was one of relative stability. But I think as we are all experiencing now, we are now entering into a period of increased turbulence as the geopolitical balance of power is shifting from a unipolar era to some form of multipolarity. And historically, such transitions come at a heightened risk of conflict and war. And we can already see how this heightened tensions have played out in the wars of Syria and Yemen and Mali and the Sahel, and of course now also in Ukraine. And this sense of anxiety, in a sense, that we are probably all experiencing has been further exacerbated by the fast-paced technological developments that have radically changed the way we process information and communications. Paul Sevier wrote actually in 1998 already that our technologies have become more powerful than our theories. And he pointed out that we are able to do things that we do not understand, and we can't grasp all the consequences of their applications. And all these different developments, also focusing very much on the impact of climate change, separately, but also especially when compounded, can increase the risk of conflict, depending, of course, a lot on how we choose to act in particular moments when we are under stress. So in the Environment of Peace report, which you see there on the screen, that CIPRI published in May this year, and I was one of the co-authors, we identified that there's a growing gap between the nature of the challenges we are facing now and in the foreseeable future, and the governance tools we have at our disposal. Our national, international systems of governance have become increasingly specialized, and we seem to be unable to generate knowledge across domains, knowledge about system effects, and especially when it comes to challenges that cross boundaries, that cross scales, that cross domains. And this is, of course, also true in academia. We are highly specialized. We have very few people that are able to put that different specialized areas of knowledge together to deal with the kind of system-wide effects that we see we are challenged with when it comes to managing climate change or managing the risks associated with new technologies or with the changing global order. I think this is why this space that STIAS created is so special in trying to stimulate some of that kind of cross-disciplinary and interdisciplinary work. So we need new systems of governance that are able to identify, analyze, and adapt to the dynamics at both or in both social and ecological systems, and especially how they interface. So we lack the adaptive governance knowledge and tools that can make sense of trans-scalar and whole-of-government system dynamics. And that is something that I hope this adaptive peace concept can contribute to as well. And that's why I think complexity theory provides us with particularly or is very suited to dealing with this kind of challenge we are facing, to help us to think differently about how to prevent conflict and how to make peace and how to manage change and transition in social-ecological systems. Because complexity provides us with a theoretical framework for understanding how social-ecological systems function and how they respond to stress, the kind of stress we see with climate change or conflict and so on. So I feel that if we can imply some of these insights derived from the study of complexity, we may be able to help strengthen the resilience of some of these systems, which can help them to better prevent, manage, and recover from violent conflict and other forms of stress in the future. I'm just going to take off my jacket because I don't know if you also feel it's a bit warm. So what is complexity? Jean-Paul Lederach, who is one of our leading authorities in the peace-building field, says that complexity emerged from a combination of multiplicity and simultaneity. In other words, many things happening at the same time, which I think there was a film on the circuit recently, which I think is so apt for this kind of description. You may remember the title, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. But maybe one way to explain complex systems is to compare them with complicated systems. And a good example of a complicated system is a machine, like the rockets we use to send into space. Now, they are highly sophisticated. They require a very large number of components in different domains, aviation and engineering, and they require quite sophisticated feedback loops. But once we have mastered that ability to send a rocket into space, we can repeat that and do that over time and time again with a fairly high degree of certainty that it will perform as it has been designed. A complex system, in contrast, like any human society, is highly dynamic and nonlinear. That means each of the elements in a human society, that's each of us and our institutions, are continuously reacting to developments around us, and we make choices based on the information available to us. And unfortunately for the economists in the room, this is not always rational decisions that we take. So regardless of whether our choices are rational or not, cumulatively and collectively, millions of our choices interact and generate system-level emergent effects. So if we apply this to the field of peace studies, and in peace studies we work specifically to try to help societies prevent people and groups to resort to violent conflict and to pursue their interest using violence. Right? So the ability of complex systems to self-organize also means that the components in a system can solve their problems themselves. If a rocket breaks down, a technician needs to fix it, right? But in human society, we have the ability for the society itself to find its own solutions. And this is due to the non-linearity in our system. So everything was programmed and planned beforehand. A rocket can't fix itself, but societies can. Of course, they can do with a little bit of help from time to time, which is where the peace builders come in. But that's a critically important distinction to understand between how societies function and how mechanical systems like rockets function. Another important distinction is that when we talk about mechanical systems, there's normally a beginning and an end. A rocket takes off and lands. But most social systems evolve over time. We tend to think of conflicts as something specific, but conflicts are normally only an episode in a longer period of evolution, of social evolution. And if we understand better that the conflicts we are dealing with is just a snapshot, one moment in a larger evolution, that also differs the way we approach conflict. Think, for instance, of Guy mentioned cricket, of a cricket game or a soccer game where there's no end. It means there's no winners and losers at the end of the game. It means that the focus then perhaps shifts away from who the winners and losers are to the quality of the game, the ethics of the game, the relationships between the different players. Because although there may be, if we take the South African example, a particular milestone that we reached in 1994 at the end of apartheid and when we started our multiracial democracy, certainly conflict didn't end in 1994 and it didn't start with apartheid. So we are dealing with a much longer process that we need to focus on, as opposed to being so singularly focused on that particular moment that we are trying to influence. So I think when we talk about complex systems, I would like you to think about it and And maybe the next time somebody approaches you and when you're dealing with some kind of a challenge in the social sciences and they tell you it's not rocket science, you can tell them, indeed it's not, it's much more complex than rocket science. So in my project on adaptive peace, I've, as I mentioned, used complexity theory as a way of framing how we do peacemaking and peace building, and have framed it in the context of this adaptive peace concept. And I'll explain a little bit what that concept means for me. So maybe a kind of an overall description would be to say that adaptive peace is a new approach where peace builders, together with the people affected by conflict, actively engage in an iterative process of inductive learning and adaptation. And I'll unpack those various concepts that's in that dense sentence. But it's also a theoretical framework for understanding and navigating the complexity inherent in trying to nudge social and ecological systems towards self-sustainable peace, importantly, without causing harm. And I'll explain how our peace-building work can sometimes cause harm. One way of explaining adaptive peace is perhaps to contrast it with the mainstream approach to peace building, which I would call a determined design approach. And I gave you the puzzle earlier in terms of the overall increase in conflict and risk in our society at the moment. That's maybe the big puzzle. But the smaller puzzle I'm working on is then how to improve our ability to manage conflicts and to sustain peace. And what I'm describing here is really the challenge that we're trying to address. So this mainstream approach to peace that have probably dominated our field for the last 40 years or so is based on the assumption that peace builders have the knowledge and the agency to resolve conflicts. Right? We have the expertise to make an assessment of a conflict, to come up with a diagnosis or a solution, and then to implement that through a various set of programs and so on. And this is based on international standards, norms, skills, institutions that we think are the kind of institutions that societies in conflict should adapt in order for them to improve the way they manage conflict. And of course, a lot of these are based on European and American state formation experience. But over time, poor performance and the repeated failures, some of which I highlighted earlier, have led to a realization amongst most scholars and practitioners in the field that this linear, mechanistic, determined design approach to peace may work well for rockets, but they suck at making peace. And let me mention perhaps 3 factors which I think the determined design approach miss or have failed to recognize in their approach to conflict. First is that what peace means in practice needs to be context-specific, so not derived from a preconceived idea of what a society should look like. Generalizations, of course, help us in our academic literature and at the policy level, but for people affected by a specific conflict, peace needs to be transformational, and it needs to be something that is tangible in their everyday lives. And unfortunately, many of our international peacemaking efforts are undertaken at such a level of abstraction that for ordinary people it has no tangible meaning in their lives. The second critical factor I think that the determined design approach has missed is that peace is something that needs to emerge from engagement, from practice. It's not a new constitution that some experts have drawn up, or it's not a new police station that have been built with donor funding. It's an emergent, transformational engagement and evolution of values and attitude and knowledge and behavior. And this needs to come through or emerge through active engagement and participation in social change processes by the communities affected by conflict. So we have a sense of what adaptive peace is not predetermined, but how does adaptive peace actually work? So a few ideas about the adaptive peace method or methodology. So adaptive peace is a method that is specifically designed to cope with complexity. In other words, to cope with the kind of uncertainty and unpredictability that we've sketched earlier. And because we can't predict how a system will respond when we intervene through some kind of a programmatic or other attempt to influence how a society will behave, we have to generate knowledge about the system through engaging with it. So we do while learning and we learn whilst doing. And we have to continuously adapt our knowledge based on what we learn from our actions, from the feedback we receive as a result of our actions. And there are three key elements to the adaptive approach, which is intent, variation, and selection. If we apply this to a specific intervention, for instance, the UN peacekeeping operation in South Sudan, trying to prevent intercommunal conflict in a particular context, it means that the first step you need to take is to clarify what it is you want to achieve, what your intent is. And then you need to, based on your analysis, consider a number of possible solutions. And this is where the variety comes in which one of the distinctions between the kind of determined design approach, which typically come up with one solution, one hypothesis. This approach is specifically built on because we can't know beforehand, we need to explore and experiment with a number of different approaches. So we then have to implement simultaneously a number of these approaches, and then we have to monitor very closely through feedback which of those approaches seem to be achieving the desired effect, which don't, and then we need a very active selection process where we stop doing those things that don't work. Those that seem to have some promise, we can expand further, we can increase variety. One of the important things that we recognize also is that if something is working today, it doesn't mean it's going to be working 3 months from now. And it's because societies respond. There are always winners and losers, especially in the context of conflict. And something that may be effective today, somebody has figured out how to go around it, a few weeks from now. And that's why you need to continuously monitor, not, oh, this works and implement it. It's not a fire and forget program. This method requires continuous adaptation. And that's why we talk about the importance of the iterative element of the adaptive methodology. So this is a process that's scalable from local to global levels and is transferable from research or conflict analysis, in other words, developing our knowledge about conflicts, through to program policy design or to monitoring and evaluation. A very important element of adaptive peace is the relationship with the people affected by conflict. Because our intent with adaptive peace is to assist communities or a society to strengthen their resilience and adaptive capacity of their social institutions, because our aim is self-sustainability, it's very important to involve the people affected by conflict in every aspect of the adaptive peace process. Ideally, the people involved need to be in a position to make all the critical choices related to how a particular programmatic intervention is going to have an impact on their lives. And this is where insights from complexity theory help us to understand how self-organization maintains and transforms complex systems and give us a theoretical basis for explaining why it is that for peace processes to become self-sustainable, they have to emerge from within. So this is why I'm going to focus on 3 dimensions of the implications of complexity and adaptive peace for how we engage with conflict and peace systems. Firstly, focusing on how we understand, how we can generate knowledge about these complex systems we are dealing with. And then, what does this tell us about how we can try to influence complex systems? And lastly, what does this tell us about how we have to manage ourselves, our institutions, when we as peace builders or peacemakers, when we try to influence a complex system? So a few ideas about what this means for us when we talk about generating knowledge. The most important, I think, insight here from complexity is that uncertainty, unpredictability, and irreproducibility are characteristics of complex systems. Some of us just followed closely together with Jerry the election results in Kenya. We couldn't know beforehand exactly what the outcome would be, and when the results were announced, we couldn't know for certain whether that could trigger violence or not, and we don't know today exactly how the situation will be resolved. And that is not because we lack data or we don't have enough computing power, but because the social systems we are working with are non-linear and dynamic. They are emergent. And that means that we need this inductive, adaptive approach for generating knowledge of such systems. So from a peace-building perspective, this means that our agency to understand social and ecological systems and our ability to influence them will always be limited and provisional. So a certain humbleness is extremely important in this approach. The knowledge we have now is always provisional in the sense that it's not the answer, it's just the information we have at the moment, and we need to be continuously open to adapt and add new knowledge or adjust the knowledge we had before when new information becomes available. And this is why the feedback process of learning from our actions is so important in this area. We've talked about understanding how this influence, this adaptive and complexity approach influences our ability to generate knowledge, but let's also focus now on how it affects our ability to influence complex systems. You'll see on the slide here on the left is a graph of the peace process in Iraq following the 1991 Gulf War. And as is often the case when there's clear winners and losers in a war, the trajectory after the war here is quite linear and progressive. But if you look at the slide on the right-hand side, or the graph on the right-hand side, which gives us a trajectory of the civil war in South Sudan between 2006 and 2019, you can see there were several ceasefires that broke down and a few peace agreements that broke down and frequent relapses into war. And very often when we engage with peace processes, it looks much more like it does on the right than on the left. The surprising thing is that the dominant approach to peace building and peacemaking is still very linear. It expects a clear linear graph like you see on the left. It's designed for that kind of process. But we need to have abilities to manage peace that look much more to dealing with the processes like we're engaging with on the right. So the point of these graphs and examples are to remind us that trying to resolve conflict and build peace is nothing like trying to send a rocket into space. It's much more about how we can adapt our theories and our approaches on a continuous basis in response to how the societies are reacting to their environment and our own attempts to try and influence them. So a few ideas around how we need to think differently about influencing complex systems. I think the first is that we need to recognize that we can't control and change processes in complex systems, we can at best influence change. Individuals and societies are not passive patients. Imagine if you are building a bridge and the bridge is reacting to how you're building it, or you send a rocket into space and the rocket emerge various behaviors as you are in space, right? It's completely different context. As we engage with the communities and societies and people, they respond and they react, and that creates this dynamic where we can't control what's going to happen and we can't predict exactly what's going to happen beforehand. And that's why we have to explore multiple interventions and learn from that action. A second insight I think we need to think about in terms of the implications for how we influence complex systems is that the predetermined approach to managing peace starts with an end state. It starts, for instance, with a multi-party democracy is what we would like to see in a particular context. And then it tries to engineer a causal path to achieve that. But the adaptive peace approach differs in the sense that we have an intent to achieve a certain broad outcome like self-sustainable peace, but we are not dogmatic about how to get there. The focus is rather on the process. Through learning from experience and through engaging with the people affected by conflict, we trust that that process will generate the most self-sustainable outcome that is relevant for that context. So I think this means versus ends is an important distinction. And the last thing I want to mention here is resilience. I think there's been a broad shift in the last few years in the peace, but also the development and humanitarian and disaster communities, away from a focus on the external role, the role of international peace builders, to try and solve peace for local communities. And instead, the focus is now on helping to strengthen the resilience of these communities and their adaptive capacity so that they are able to manage stress and setbacks on their own. And while this trend does generate some concerns, for instance, a shifting of responsibility to perhaps local communities that are not necessarily have the ability to influence all the various factors that cause the stresses they experience. So if you think of climate change, for instance, local communities can adapt, but they can't necessarily influence where that climate change comes from, right? So there's still an important role for actors at other scales to try and mitigate the effects that are being generated by something like climate change, whilst at the same time it's useful to work on the resilience and adaptive capacities of communities under stress, because it builds on this concepts of self-organization and self-sustainability. And then lastly, a few words about the implications for how we undertake processes or interventions when it comes to trying to influence societies. I think the core implication for undertaking interventions or operations relate to the fact that these operations need to cope with this complexity I mentioned earlier, and the high levels of uncertainty and their inability to control outcomes. And that is why this adaptive peace methodology is not just relevant for how we generate knowledge or how we influence complex systems, but also for how we manage our own actions. And maybe I can give you a practical example here, because I was involved in a process of helping to design a comprehensive performance assessment system for United Nations peacekeeping operations that gave us an opportunity to apply some of these ideas of complexity and adaptive peace to a very specific international undertaking, United Nations peacekeeping operations. And this is quite a large bureaucracy, as you can imagine. We're talking about maybe 100,000 personnel in a dozen operations across the world in some of the most difficult environments, with a budget of about $6 billion. And if you asked me as well, maybe 5 years ago, if you would think an institution like that would be interested in engaging with ideas of complexity, I would have definitely not thought it was possible. But it's been a very rewarding experience of working with the United Nations on this particular system. And in short, what this means is that so in terms of focusing on starting with the context specificity of conflict, is that although these operations receive a mandate from the United Nations Security Council that tells them what the Security Council wants them to achieve, they have to figure out how to achieve that in the specific context that they are dealing with. And that means that these operations start with a particular context analysis through which they then try to identify what are the critical drivers and stakeholders that they want to influence, and they then design their specific programs and interventions on that analysis. But then, very importantly, at the same time, they develop a set of indicators so that they can track how these various actions what effect they are having on the community, and whether it's having that desired effect that we've identified in terms of trying to influence the knowledge or behavior of attitudes of particular stakeholders. And then there's a very deliberate iterative step in big operations every 4 months or smaller operations every 6 months, where various people involved in these actions come together and consider and explore the implications of the indicators, which tell them how the system has been changing, and whether they ask themselves whether the actions they have undertaken have actually had an influence on those changes. And that then leads to adaptations in the form of changing their programmatic behavior, of shifting resources, and so forth. And so it generates the kind of information that leaders and managers in these kind of organizations need to make sure that they can continuously adapt their institutions to be as effective as possible. So that's how this kind of ideas can also be implemented in a very practical way in an institution like the United Nations peace operations. Maybe one last thing to mention when we talk about implications for how we undertake peace operations is, what is the appropriate role of international peace builders or a mediator? And as I've mentioned before, one of the critical aspects and insights from complexity theory is the need that conflict needs to emerge out of this self-organization that societies need to go through the development of their own social institutions for how they react to conflict. And in this context, we know that every time a peace builder or a mediator solves a problem for a community, we've at the same time, even with good intent, missed an opportunity for that community to respond to their own feedback and to find solutions themselves. And that is why I think it's extremely important for the international community in general, or mediators, to limit themselves to process facilitation, not to provide content, but to create an enabling space where the communities or people affected by conflict can find their own solutions to their problems and develop the kind of institutions they need in order to have the resilience to manage their own stresses and setbacks. So in conclusion, I think I will summarize my project here at STIAS by saying that adaptive peace is an alternative approach to the mainstream, to making and sustaining peace, that it's aimed at navigating the complexity inherent in trying to nudge social-ecological change processes, and that it tries to do that without causing harm. And this differs significantly or fundamentally from the linear cause and effect problem-solving approach, and it does so by following an alternative process, an inductive doing whilst learning and learning whilst doing approach. And a very important part of the adaptive peace approach is this normative and functional relationship with the people affected by conflict. Recognizing that the primary agency of resolving conflict lies with the people affected by conflict, not with the international community. International peace builders can't make peace on behalf of those communities or societies that it is engaging in. So I hope this talk gave you an insight into the project that I'm going to be working on here at STIAS over the next couple of months. And I look forward to sharing the final product with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Cedric. You mentioned this as an alternative to the mainstream, so let's hope that one of the outcomes of your work would be that this becomes the mainstream approach to peace building. And thank you for a really wonderful demonstration of how complexity thinking can be applied to a field such as this, and potentially to demonstrating how one can think of applying that in other social ecological areas, systems and areas. So we'll take questions from the room here. Our online Q&A function has malfunctioned. So I'm afraid for those online, please send us your comments and any comments, any messages and questions you'd like to post to Cedric by email, and we'll send it through to him. We're a nice large audience, so I'm sure we'll fill up all our available time with questions from the audience here, and we'll start with Sam at the back.
Thanks so much, Cedric. Thank you. You're a long way away. It's hard to project that far. Thank you so much for sharing this work with us. It's just very compelling. I wanted to ask about, there's some really, I think, screamingly obvious implications of this for the way in which low-level peace-building activities, you can hear me? Yeah. The ways in which low-level peace-building activities are funded, which is predominantly on short-term project cycles of, sometimes as little as 12 months, maybe 3 years, maybe 5 if you're lucky, which doesn't allow for failure, it doesn't allow for any of the sort of iterative work that you're talking about. And then the monitoring and evaluation around those points in the opposite direction, which is to sort of prove that the project you did solved all these problems and all of those kinds of things. And I was fascinated that you had this experience with the UN and their willingness to engage in this. I wondered if you could say something about the conditions that led to that UN willingness to engage in this kind of theoretical work and making it practical, and whether or not you think there's any possibility of those conditions translating to sort of lower level, community level, civil society type peace building activities.
Do you want me to go straight away? Thank you very much, Sam. I mean, I think the funding you describe is partly, influencing the mainstream, as I mentioned, and vice versa. So we are dealing with a very deep structural challenge in that we have created this idea that we have the agency to solve these problems, and therefore those people who give funding want reassurance that your plan is going to work, right? So we have to come up with these linear proposals. All of us who do research proposals will know that we have to do these kind of proposals which convince somebody that if we do this, this is going to happen. But I do find that there are more and more willingness to engage with this kind of alternative approaches in various areas. So you find that both large funders like USAID or the UK DFID before it became now FCDO, that they have proportions of their overall funding that they are dedicating to adaptive development approaches or adaptive peace-building approaches to try and explore and understand different approaches. And actually there's, in a sense, a lot more happening at the local and civil society peace-building organizations. Several NGOs that are really focusing on local peace. And the larger funders also now have a kind of a shift towards what they call localization, which takes on some of these ideas, but often not far enough. Often it's more like a mirroring of the idea as opposed to really truly engaging with an inductive approach or a participatory approach that really shifts agency to a local community. And the M&E of that is, of course, very important because this focus on results have created an expectation that we need to show the results that we've achieved, and that if we changed what we've done, we need to somehow justify our deviation from plan. I would turn that around and say that if you've not deviated from your plan, over a year or 3 years in a highly dynamic environment, you are clearly not paying attention. You don't know what's happening. So I would actually like to see how have you adapted. Show me how you've adapted your plans over the last year or two. And I think that kind of thinking is starting to come in many different ways, but it's not mainstream yet.
Thank you, Sam. We had, I've seen 4 further hands in the following order, Paul, Andreas, Simon, and Jody. And we'll take them one at a time in that order. Please do use the microphone for the sake of our online audience.
Good. Thank you so much for a very fascinating lecture. I think it's extremely important, especially since the vast majority of the social sciences, unfortunately, are engaged in rocket building, both in economics, in sociology, in political science, etc. So that alone makes it very, very important. I have one very basic question, and that is, how do you define a system? And what do you include in the category of a system? Because you talk about like local communities, for example, as a system, if I understand you correctly. But would a village be a system? Would a clan be a system? Would a state be a system? Like what is included in this category and how do you define it?
Yeah. Systems are in the eye of the beholder, right? So you determine when you analyze a particular area where the boundaries are. And those boundaries are always more determined by wanting to study the system than the fact that boundaries somehow exist. It's not arbitrary. We can make a distinction between, who's the local and who's the international when we deal with the conflict in South Sudan. And then the moment you say that and you start scratching on that idea, you realize how gray it can become in certain instances. Are South Sudanese who work for the United Nations local or international, etc.? Are South Sudanese who are living in Washington, D.C. and playing a role as diaspora in South Sudan international or local? So these boundaries are always very gray, and the boundaries are open, right? People move between boundaries, and we all belong to various systems and subsystems, as individuals or as institutions. So there isn't one fixed way to identify a particular set of systems in a particular conflict context. But as a researcher dealing with some kind of system analysis, you then have to apply and justify those systems that you identify and work with in that particular context. But I think this is also one of the challenges with what I mentioned in terms of our tools not matching our reality, because we are typically in these contexts. I'm a peace builder, you're an economist, you work on justice, somebody else works on security reform. But the people in South Sudan or Somalia or Ukraine or Yemen don't experience those things as different fields. They just experience the overall effect that these things are having on them. So yes, we need those domains as a way to engage with and analyze the problem, but we also need to see how they fit together and create system-wide effects. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Paul. Andreas.
Yes, thank you very much, Cedric. As an economist with a focus on institutions, I really enjoyed your talk. I have one question. I still have the impression that you assume that the external peacemaking institution has no own vested interests. But I would claim they have vested interests. So how can you make sure that these vested interests are not overriding the whole process?
No, absolutely. It is, of course, international peace builders or mediators have a vested interest or have a particular interest in what they're doing, even if it's just to look good and to generate soft power from the fact that they are seen as peace builders. So it's not something we could somehow find a way of excluding. It's something we have to manage all the time. It's something to do, of course, first of all, with the recognition by those peace builders of their own effects and interests in the situation. Very often we think of ourselves as somehow being on the outside, influencing a particular system, but really we are part of the political economy of that situation. And that is something we need to engage with in that interaction with our local partners or the communities and societies we engage in. Thank you, Andreas.
Great, and Andreas. We have Simon Becker next.
Yes, thank you very much indeed for what I think is really a challenging approach for many of us. I'm a sociologist, South African sociologist. I've been involved in social and political issues in Africa for some time. And some 10 years ago, I read a book, the title of which is Violence and Social Orders by Douglas North and a number of his colleagues. And I'd like to say three things about that lens, that approach, and then ask you about them, if I may. The first is, it is Hobbesian in the sense that their lens says there is going to be violence in a community, in a society, in a state, unless there is a set of institutions, a particular set of institutions that can offer some kind of non-violent alternative to violence as a way of life. That's the first point which I took from the book. The second is that with regard to the institutions, they make a very clear distinction between personal institutions, where the constraints and the incentives don't operate the same for everyone, on the one hand, and impersonal institutions, where the constraints, like the rule of law, where the constraints and the incentives operate for everyone. And then thirdly, where I agree completely with your analysis, they have an open access order, which is the Western state, and a limited access order, and they imply that the open access order should parachute in their institutions into African societies, which they've tried to do and don't work. My questions are, what do you think of that lens in general? Why do you not use the term violence and you use the term conflict? Because they very clearly point to violence. And then the third is, does the distinction when you intervene in communities and try to get self-development taking place, does the distinction between a personal institution and an impersonal institution play any role?
Thank you, Simon. That's a good set of questions. I mean, first of all, I think it's important to recognize that some people use violence consciously. Violence is not something just abnormal or an unintended consequence. Very many groups or institutions consciously use violence to achieve their aims, right? And part of engaging with these situations is, making peace, but also disrupting those actors who consciously use violence to achieve their aims. And that's why maybe a decade or more ago, there was quite a strong literature on spoilers and how to manage spoilers in conflicts. Right? And you're absolutely right about the difference between violence and violent conflict and conflict. Because conflict is normal. Conflict is something we all experience all the time. We need conflict to bring innovation and generation, right? We need to be under stress as societies. But it's violent conflict that is the negative element that we are trying to manage when in conflict resolution or in peace studies. And research suggests that the societies that are able to prevent violent conflict from emerging are those that have what I would call social institutions present, that are actively working towards coexistence, to tolerance, that create mechanisms for managing conflict. A very practical example would be the National Peace Accord that we had in South Africa in the early 90s. that was a mechanism that proactively engaged and tried to deal with potential violent conflict or conflict that manifested all the time. I think we need both what you call personal and non-personal, which I think you mean, or I would understand it as like state institutions or formal institutions of the state at various levels, like the justice system or something, and the social institutions, which could be, you know, any kind of organization that we have. It could also be more informally our norms, but let's think of something more practical, like a church organization or a sports club or something like that. And I think one of the things we saw different in the South African post-apartheid experience or managing the transition from many of the other conflicts we're dealing with is precisely the degree to which every institution in the country was somehow transforming itself and engaging and reaching out to communities. And that depth of participating in a transition we seldom seem to achieve in many other conflict situations where the peace agreement seems to be stuck at the level of the elites, and ordinary people are not feeling engaged in that process. So I think the role of personal or social institutions are critical in an ability to transform a society peacefully. Thank you, Simon.
Thanks, Simon. Next was Jody.
Thanks so much, Cedric. This really was terrific, and just a fantastic exploration of complexity theory, which applies to so many things. So my questions are about power and inequality. So recognizing the attractiveness of your adaptive model and of self-organizing, self-adapting, you can also get very stable states for years, for decades, where there is immense inequality and oppression by gender, by ethnicity, by class, by religion. So talk to us about that. In this system, if you go in and the existing power imbalance contributes to ongoing inequality in the absence of violence, how do you nudge that in the right direction?
Yeah, that is such a difficult challenge. What we find in most conflict situations are that the people perpetuating the conflict have the most resilience. They are typically the people who have access to capital, who are strong in the economy, who have something to lose in terms of changing the system. And they are typically, much more resilient than some of the new forces that comes in. So disrupting their strength, their ability is, of course, quite a challenge. And of course, they will defend their interests. And this is what we see in many of these situations. At the same time, what we have very actively over the last 20 to 30 years tried to impact on those power inequalities. We've made a huge effort to deal with inequality in Afghanistan, for instance, over the last 20 years. Pushed millions or billions of dollars into that process. And so we can look at many, many other situations. And very often it has prolonged the conflict because it has disrupted the developments in that society along the lines that we think were necessary to bring stability and self-sustainability in those processes. So I'm quite reluctant to impose our ideas of equality on societies. At the same time, the international community today will not tolerate mass atrocities, crimes, or various other elements of inequality and so on. So to strike that balance, I personally would favor more of a situation where we allow societies to focus on what they think are their primary responsibilities and try to help to facilitate that process. Also to facilitate and empower those that are, perhaps left to the society's own devices, wouldn't have the ability to engage in those processes. And then the other distinction I must make is the distinction between me as an academic making an analysis than that, and let's say a country like Norway, where I currently live. Norway obviously have very specific interests, and they will choose to fund certain things and not fund other things. And they would have a particular interest in, for instance, promoting gender equality or other particular normative approaches, and that's what they would be willing to fund, and they won't be willing to fund other things. So I'm not dictating, what individual states or organizations feel they want to engage with and not. But I'm saying that if our real interest is self-sustainable peace, not a peace that looks like our country or our normative system, but something that works for that society, that will bring stability in that society and peace in that society. And with peace, then, one can talk about positive peace and social justice. But I would lean to giving that society more space to find their own ways of achieving peace and sustainability.
So just one quick follow-up, which is to say, I think my challenge with that is that treats the society as if there is one society and one viewpoint. So I'm really glad you raised Afghanistan. There has been prolonged conflict. But I also think the voice is very clear coming out of women leaders who are staying and women leaders who have been able, have been forced to, but have been able to leave and in exile, that many don't, from within the society. This isn't external. They don't want to give up jobs. They don't want to give up their daughter's education. They don't want to give up their own education. This is two groups, equal size, completely unequal, with very different views.
Absolutely. And what we need to think is to think about what as an international community we did in Afghanistan over the last 20 years, which has resulted in this outcome, and what can we do differently. So that's precisely the puzzle that I'm working on. How can we create a different outcome than the outcome that we helped to create in Afghanistan? And certainly the adaptive peace approach, do not think of a society as one society, but of, at all these different scales, engaging with all the different elements of a society. Of course, it's very easy to say and very difficult to achieve in practice. But I hear you, and that's an extremely important dilemma in this field.
Thanks, Jody. So I've seen 5 further names in the following order. We'll take them: Dave, Guy, Louis, Jarpa, and Anthea. So Dave.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. I have 2 questions. The Norwegian government, as most governments do, accepts the Westphalian settlement. So at what point do you think it's right for a Norwegian to interfere in the affairs of another country? And my second question is on the mathematics of complexity theory. So my mathematical colleagues who work on dynamic adaptive networks find there's often threshold properties in those networks, that they're homeostatic until a threshold is reached, and then they flip to a completely different state, from war to peace, for example. And I can see your methodology would prod a network up or down the level of violence, but would it help with flipping a network into a different stable state, which may be necessary to achieve what you want to achieve, or better achievement?
Thanks so much. The right to intervene in a different system. I think most people, and if I think of Norwegian politicians or Norwegian scholars, will say that they only have a right to interfere if they're invited in. And they probably won't use the word interfere, right? Precisely because of what we've been discussing. But at the same time, I think especially in Europe and America, we have, as Jody specifically emphasized, we come with a specific normative idea. I mean, it's in the Constitution or the Founding Act of the European Union that we will promote our normative ideas. That is what those institutions are made for. So those institutions will promote and they will intervene in, let's say, a situation like we've mentioned Afghanistan, with the purpose of trying to get the norms and values that they think is important to be established there. My point would be that that is something slightly different from pursuing self-sustainable peace. Then you are pursuing an intervention to transfer norms. And whether that is self-sustainable or not is maybe a hopeful outcome, but that's not the most important thing for you. The most important thing is that that society ends up with the same norms that you have, and there's a theory of change that if they do, they will also be peaceful. But what we've seen in many cases is that that actually doesn't necessarily happen. And part of that, I think, goes to your second point, because let's take something like democracy or multi-party democracy, right? To manage multi-party democracy, which is very conflict-creating, you need quite a sophisticated set of institutions. And if through international pressure a particular country adopts a multi-party political system, before they have those institutions in place, we are likely to see the kind of electoral violence that we see in many different places, right? So that's why I emphasize so much the importance of building these social institutions, giving these societies the space to generate and build their institutions. And I think when you have a certain number or extent of those social institutions, that's where you have that tipping point, that which you have that flip in the society where most people in the society think that using violence to achieve your political aims is unacceptable, and where you have the institutions to try and make that sustainable. And I think that often happens in a kind of a tipping point moment. And of course, you can't say beforehand, mathematically, when you'll reach that moment in a particular context. But I think that's very much what we see in
the aim is to change the society so that the state has the monopoly of violence.
No, I would say, again, that's probably quite Westphalian. And we see in many societies today, outside of the Western state formation experience, that we've got such an interlinked global system that many other societies are unable to develop the level of state formation that we've seen in the West. So I would say self-sustainable peace is a society where the majority of people in that society believe that it's illegitimate to use violence to achieve your aims, and have institutions to maintain that, regardless of, and that has to be not just the state. It has to be institutions throughout the society. And that's what we see in the West as well. In Norway, it's not the state that maintains our society. It's institutions throughout the society. Where I live in Norway, I hardly ever see a police officer. But when we do peacekeeping operations, we very often think, we need to train the police because they will ensure social justice, right? But it's actually much deeper than that. It is, the whole society managing their own justice in a certain way, and the police is only there to deal with the exceptional cases. So, I'm not so much focused on the state. I think we had this enormous focus on institution building, 2000 coming out of the World Bank report, and I would certainly favor a much broader approach to institutions than just the state.
Thanks, Dave. Guy.
Thanks so much, Cedric. I just have a question in relation to very much local level conflict, and conflict that's obviously been kind of violent and contentious, and it's about that definition about nudging towards solutions that do no harm. Now, in the kind of adaptive model that you've been writing about and you presented on, it very much talks about the sort of bottom-up approach around those involved in the conflict, affected by the conflict, finding a solution to that conflict. Now, the question here is there a role for resource people, the kind of peace builders, to help nudge that? And that, I presume that's a complex one. And is there a role for a menu to kind of go, well, here's your conflict, these are the things you can try based on research? Or is the adaptive one saying, well, people just need to figure it out for themselves, it may go more violent, it may not? What's the sort of thinking on that? Thank you.
I think in many conflict situations, you are stuck in a certain path dependency, and it's very difficult for people. They are in conflict precisely because there's institutions and they've not been able to prevent and manage that conflict, and they find it very difficult to get out of that on their own. So there is a role for others to help them in that process. It could be other local peace builders. It doesn't have to be international, it could be from the national level, but it could also be, and very often is some form of national support. Very often these days it's international working with local NGOs and peace builders who have knowledge of the area and so forth. And then that engagement process is precisely what I'm trying to grapple with. Of course, peace builders will come with an idea of how they want to engage with the society. So I don't think we can somehow not have a menu. But if we understand that having a menu and having a preconceived idea can actually disrupt the ability of these societies or communities to find their own path, then we can maybe be much more sensitive in how we try and engage with those menus or those ideas. Give them as information. In other places it has worked this way, and many peace processes do work like that. I've also personally been involved in many situations where a peace builder is engaged with a particular peace process, and then they would like to expose the various parties in that process to other processes. How did it work in South Africa? How did it work in Colombia? How did you deal with this problem in Northern Ireland? So that kind of information sharing of how it has worked in other places, I think is very useful. Or scenario building, you have these options. But the more you fill that space with the peace builder or the mediator providing all this information, the more the parties of the conflict will sit back and listen. Right? And that's the dynamic that we need to change. We need to create a space where the parties determine the space, the content, and where the mediator or the peace builders facilitate the process. The moment we overstep that mark, and of course it's very difficult, that's context specific, but when you start determining content and influencing the process, that's where I see many of the problems arising.
Thank you, Guy. So next up was Louis.
Thanks, Cedric. It's fascinating to listen to you, and I want to share your optimism that the agency lies with those people who are actually involved in conflict. But now, the one thing which is bugging me and is still keeping me on the pessimistic side is the issue of religion. And I'm particularly thinking of an example that has not been mentioned today. I mean, Western Asia, or as it is also called, the Middle East, where religious ideologies are in a certain sense solidified through fundamentalistic interpretations of sacred scriptures, of history, and which is in the end leading to sort of solidified ethnicities. What if those agents are actually the problem? What if the change that is necessary is actually those local actors who have to sustain the peace? So my question boils down to, when religion is involved, is it something more wicked than other problems?
That's very difficult, and I don't have a particular answer for you, but there are very many scholars who focus in on that particular area. In generally, I would say it's identity. And your identity could be religious, or identity could be racial or cultural or ethnic. So most conflicts we are dealing with have this identity element. And if you come to a point, which, in kind of conflict resolution theory, we talk about a mutual hurting stalemate. If you come to a point where you realize you don't have other alternatives, that you are interdependent on each other, you are in a specific space, either you can continue with conflict, which you at a certain point realize is undesirable and is not going to achieve your own objectives. Then is the point of ripeness, what we would call for conflict resolution, right? That's where people, regardless of what identity has been at play, then reach a point where they start saying, okay, we don't know how we're going to do it, but we're going to have to figure out a way to coexist in this space. And that's a moment where mediation or peace builders can then start to work with communities like that.
Thank you, Louis. We had Japa next.
Thank you very much, Cedric. I like your emphasis on involving local actors who are either catalysts to the conflict or people who have been affected by the conflict. I've heard you say that over and over again, and that's really important. And I think that in this process, it's not just involving them, but making sure that their voices are actually heard and that their processes and thoughts are not just extracted. once again and taken as the expert's voice and then regurgitated onto them. So within that scope, one of those actors I am thinking about, and I don't know if this features in your work, is the role of women. And as you know, the UN passed Resolution 135 on women in peacekeeping. Since then, studies have showed that when women have been involved in peacemaking processes, the peace lasts longer. So with this adaptive approach, complex as human beings are, how does gender feature in? What role do women have to play in this theory you're working on? Thank you.
I think peace builders have to reach out to all the different dimensions of society that play a role in possibly contributing to a self-organized or a sustaining peace. And women is 50% of the population. So you can't possibly do that without finding various ways of engaging with women. And how that would be in a particular context will depend, at which level you're working, it's local. But certainly, I would say peace builders, and that we see happening, of course, in many different ways in practice. But peace builders need to reach out, find those people that maybe do not have a voice, encourage that voice, create opportunities for engagement, and create spaces then where women's organizations and others can engage. So I think that's part of what I mean with process facilitation. Without dictating what should come out of that or what the outcome should be in a preconceived idea, but creating that space where self-organization can take place, where women can contribute and play a role in that process of self-organization. So I think peace builders have the responsibility for being that catalyst, for adding that stimuli to the process. Thanks.
Thanks, Jopa. We had Anthea.
Thanks. Cedric, you mentioned diasporas, just in a passing sort of way. But it suddenly occurred to me that there's barely a conflict on this planet that doesn't have a diaspora sitting somewhere else on the planet with vested interests. And I wondered if that external community with its multiplicity of interests has a place in your model, because it occurs to me that it's a very volatile, it can be a very volatile part of trying to make peace, say, in a local situation.
No, absolutely, and that's often why peace initiatives that are very focused, in a country miss out on that opportunity. They maybe see the effects of the diaspora, but if you're a United Nations Special Political Mission in Sudan, your focus is in Sudan. But certainly diasporas have an enormous influence, positive and negative, on all of these conflict situations. I haven't seen as much engagement with them as I think is needed. And so most probably in many of these kind of peace engagements, you would need to have a certain number of personnel actually dedicated to engaging with the diaspora. So absolutely, I think that's a kind of a neglected area of our work.
Thanks. I saw one more hand. We have time for one more question, and that's Jeppy. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Cedric. Thank you very much for a fascinating presentation. My question is essentially related to the fact that your presentation is premised on the belief that those in conflict would be amenable to conflict resolution. And often that's not the case. Often people are quite happy to have conflict because it creates opportunity. What happens in a situation where you have one group of people exercising extreme violence vis-a-vis another group of people? According to your presentation, there would be no justification for intervention whatsoever?
It's a very good point. I think there's two types of intervention that we often confuse. So if we talk about, the peace building we do to achieve a self-sustainable peace is the kind of context within which I've situated today's talk. But another area is work to end a violent conflict. So for instance, we have the conflict in Ukraine. Today would be an obvious example. Right? And in that kind of context, you would use, as the international community, coercive means to try and bring an end to that conflict. So that's quite a different scenario than the scenario of where you want to work with people to achieve a self-sustainable peace. In that scenario, your focus is to end violence, to stop suffering, and you may use a number of carrots and sticks to try and achieve that. But as I said earlier, at some point in most conflicts, people arrive at this mutual hurting stalemate, this moment where they recognize that pursuing violence further is not going to actually help them to achieve their objectives. And it's at that point where the situation is ripe for mediation or peace building. So it's in that context, at that moment, where I think adaptive peace can really play a role in helping those communities to achieve self-sustainable peace as a method of engaging. But to arrive at that point is a different sphere of engagement. And as I mentioned, in that sphere of engagement, as an international community or as a country or as an organization, you would probably want to use a range of mechanisms, including coercive mechanisms, just to try and end that conflict and try and end the suffering.
Thank you for a wonderful set of questions probing the work that you will be doing for the rest of the semester, Cedric. So thanks to the audience. There's a lovely reception waiting for us. And a final word of thanks to Cedric for guiding us in this lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.